Welcome to the third breakout session titled Politics in Japan, the July Election and After. Let me introduce the panelists for this session. First, Mr. Keiichiro Asao, member of the House of Representatives. Mr. Michael Chuchek, Research Associate, MIT Center for International Studies, and the author of Shisaku blog. Mr. Taro Kono, member of the House of Representatives. This session is moderated by Mr. Jonathan Sobel, who is the Tokyo Bureau Chief of the Financial Times. Mr. Sobel, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see so many people given the weather. I want to jump right in, I think, and just get everyone's feeling on the state of play in Japanese politics right now. I think after the upper house elections in July, been two big pieces of, I guess, conventional wisdom about what's happening right now. One is that we are entering a period, or what is very likely to be the most stable period in Japanese politics in half a decade or more. That's to do with the combination of the LDP having both houses of parliament, the Abe administration being unusually popular, and the fact that we're not going to have another national election for 3 years, most likely. And I think the other assumption is that during that 3-year period, the focus of politics will remain on the economy. There was a lot of talk early in Abe II administration that possibly after the midterm or after the upper house elections, the focus would shift from Abenomics, which wowed everyone in the early months, to what many people think is Mr. Abe's real passion, which is the Constitution, education, history, social issues, if you like. That seems not to be happening. We're getting all kinds of assurances from the administration that it won't, that the focus will be on the economy. Those assurances seem to have informed, again, the kind of conventional wisdom about Japanese politics and what's happening right now. So I'd just like to get everyone, kind of by way of introduction in a way, to tell us, do you think those assumptions are true? And given that the kind of the theme of today's conference is a strong Japan, do you think 3 years of stability is in and of itself good for Japan? Maybe we'll just start from closest to
Start
me.
from the opposition, I guess. Well, I think the 3-year time frame is you have to divide that in two parts. There is a similar, not similar, fairly large election from a year and a half from now. And that is what we call Toitsu Chiōsenkyo. There will be a gubernatorial election of Tokyo and several other prefectures happening in 2015, April of 2015. And assembly of these prefectures will also be elected. The reason I mention this is because the consumption tax, the next time probably Prime Minister Abe has to decide whether or not to raise consumption tax will happen at the same time. That is, this time he has to decide by October 1st of this year. Next will be April of 2015. The actual raise will happen in October of 2015, but it will be, he has to decide when the actual election, local election is happening. Could he decide or not solely rely upon whether the third arrow of the Abe economic mix is working? And I'm missing my friend here, but I just heard a very good phrase by Jesper Kohl in the last session. Abe economics is asset bubble economy, and whether the asset bubble economy, ABE, is going to be real growth or not, it solely relies on the raise of productivity growth. And if that does not happen and just the consumption tax raise is there, that would mean that just the price is going up. And that would probably hurt his supporting rate. So whether or not he will be successful in the coming election 3 years from now relies on whether he could be successful in the 2-year time frame. And the reason why I say that is not just because of the economy, because if he is not successful, or if his popularity goes down, then he will have to rely on more of the special interest groups which have certain powers in gathering votes. And if he has to rely on these special interest groups, that would mean that would send at least a negative signal towards structural reform. So that's his challenge, I think.
Thank you. Why don't we just why don't we just opposition? Well, we have the actual opposition and the internal opposition, if you ask me. But yeah, Kono-san, why don't you?
Thank you.
Give us your view.
Internal opposition? Well, I guess LDP having majority in both houses don't really mean those MP who's for deregulation having majority in both houses. I mean, there are a lot of LDP members who actually have strong ties to the vested interest, and they will probably oppose internally to the third arrow of the Abenomics. I mean, the first 2 arrows of Abenomics is pretty easy. You know, there's nothing for politician to worry about, you know, to threat BOJ to change the monetary policy or, you know, relax it more and spend more money on public construction. There's no political capital necessary for those. The third arrow, so-called deregulation, is a difficult part. Whether or not we can deliver, that is a test for LDP. And we have to do it early because it hurts. It hurts certain people. And we have to sort of make the pain comes early so that we can recover from that, and actually it leads to the economic growth in the third year when we see the national probably dual election. So can we really do that or not? It's going to be the difficult task. And I sort of agree with Sawa-san that the second consumption tax raise will be more difficult. I don't really care too much about the local election, but it's getting closer to the upper house election. So I think it would be better for us to just raise it 5% to 10 if it's possible, but I don't think that's happening. So the first 3% is happening next year, and the next 2%, I'm not quite sure if we can do that or not. And I don't think we should really debate over those consumption tax. That's sort of a done deal. So we should treat that as a done deal, and we should be talking about how to deregulate power industry, how to deregulate the agriculture, healthcare, childcare, or those things. There are certain industries in Japan that public companies are not allowed to participate, like agriculture or healthcare or things like that. That need to be got rid of. And that's what we have to do for the third arrow. So it's going to be, I don't know, it's going to be interesting internally to see how those freshmen of LDP member react to. I mean, there are a lot of freshmen that is connected to the vested interest in upper house for sure. But lower house, I think we see a lot of interesting young guys, and hope they would support the deregulation and will make the third arrow possible.
Mike, what about you? I mean, do you agree that that's the state of play? And also, you know, we talked a little bit in the pre-meeting about kind of the source of Abe's popularity and the differences between Abe 1 and Abe 2. I mean, Abe 1 was brutal and short. This one is getting off to a much better start. And what do you think he's learned? What do you see as the major kind of shift on his part?
Well, I'll try to answer that in 2 parts and try to do it briefly. In terms of the transformation of the LDP that has taken place under Abe, Kono Sensei has alluded to it, that there are now lots of people in the big tent of the LDP. Under the Koizumi reforms, there was a constriction and an eviction of certain kinds of members from the LDP who wouldn't go along with the radical, or not, some people say not radical, economic reform packages and budgetary reform packages that were put forth during that time, so that the big tent of the LDP, which had all kinds of people in it, became constricted. Under Abe, all kinds of people have been allowed back in, and so there is a broad variety of people who have special interests attached to them. In the fall, as Kono Sensei has said, there will be this need to confront these special interests internally within the LDP. We had during the 1990s and through the 2000s, a move towards a two-party system where there would be conflict between two parties, and those two parties coalesced into being the LDP versus the DPJ. As you can see by modern polling, however, Asawa Sensei's party has done very well, but the DPJ is sloughing off power and members left and right. And has nearly collapsed as an intellectual force, leaving effectively the LDP to fight against itself. I would be very, very depressed and worried about that, except for something that happened immediately after the House of Councilors election, within days of that election, really. One of the first cabinet decisions after that was the decision to raise the costs of elder care and health care for the elderly, which are the most consistent and most important electorate for the LDP. That the LDP would make that move, or at least the cabinet would make that move, which is politically costly and something that they really don't like doing, that they were able to get themselves going on that immediately, was very, very encouraging to me. In terms of Abe 2, I'm sorry, I'm probably going over time, but in terms of Abe 2, what has been most interesting to me is the interest that Abe himself has had in governing. During the first Abe period in office, 2006-2007, he had a lot of extraneous projects and spent a lot of time talking about exiting the post-war regime. We have had some of that. Most of it has died down since May, and instead we see a very engaged, energetic Abe working very hard on running the country, which for someone who, like myself, who was very skeptical regarding Abe coming in, again, is very encouraging.
Thank you. Some of this question of the LDP's tent and how big it's become again, post-Koizumi and under Abe, and its relationship with difficult policy decisions that are going to have to be made, has to do with the question of Abe's internal power. Now, this is a question that I've gotten a lot of conflicting responses from people on. I mean, you talk to some informed people and they say, well, Abe now has, thanks to his popularity and Abenomics, he's got absolute control over the party in spite of, yes, more people have been let back in since Koizumi, whatever, but no one can oppose him. Others say, well, actually, he seems to be this strong leader, but really he's a product of the party, and he's going to have a whole lot of trouble pushing through an agenda that goes against powerful special interests within it. And just before we move to the next question, I'd just like to ask Kono Sensei whether what the view from within right now about Abe's the power he has within the party to push through his agenda. Where do you think it lies on that spectrum of opinion?
Well, he is in control of LDP. I mean, he's very popular prime minister, and the LDP's rating is very high. But LDP's decision making is sort of diversified. There's a lot of power to the party. It's just like Chinese Communist Party. There's a government, but there's a party behind it, and the party could make some decision against the government. So how much he could control those who oppose to deregulation, I think that's going to be the key issue, and it comes by policy decisions. So everyone's sort of loyal to Abe-san because we are now reshuffling lower echelon of the government, and there's a party appointment. And once it's done, we are not quite sure. But I mean, his government is very popular, so a lot of people would ride with him.
Thank you. And I want to talk a little bit about the opposition and this realignment issue that, Michael, you brought up in a second. But first, I'd like to ask the second part of that last question, and maybe to Michael, about Abe's popularity. You know, not so much within the party, but within the electorate. I mean, he's got approval ratings that continue to butt their heads up against 70% after almost a year. It's very unusual. But I've also heard from some political scientists that if you measure if you look at voter turnout and other factors, the number of Japanese voters that are actually actively going out and supporting the LDP is maybe, like a sixth, depending on the math. I'm not doing the math myself, I'm just asking people. But, so is his popularity broad but shallow? And what does that mean for, if he's really got an eye not only on 3 years from now, but a year and a half on local elections? I mean, can he take his popularity for granted now or not?
As to the question that's frequently tossed out, that the voter participation rates were low in the last two elections, which somehow delegitimizes the LDP's and Abe's victory, I call that hogwash. That's nonsense. If the electorate doesn't show up, they don't have no reason to complain about the government they get. And how you win doesn't really matter. If it's a win, it's a win. My illustration is the famous soccer game between Brazil and Japan at the Olympics, where the Brazilians kept shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting, and the ball never went in, but one looping shot by the Japanese team managed to bounce into the Brazilian goal, and Brazil lost that game, even though it had almost its entire national team on the field. A win is a win. It doesn't matter how you win, a win is a win. Now, in terms of the second part of your question, there are, if you lay aside for a moment the new Komeito, there are two parties with deep bases, and that is the LDP and, my apologies, the communists. Every other...
You can say that word,
all other opposition parties have shallow bases. Some very committed, a very small sliver of very committed people, but for the most part, if they have won elections, it's based on a very shallow base that can flip over at any time. The DPJ went into government in 2009 completely unaware of this and lost it because of their lack of understanding of how thin their base was. The way I put it is that it's a kilometer wide and a centimeter deep. That was their support, and it evaporated away. Abe has the apparatus of the LDP behind him, and that's a deep, deep and powerful apparatus indeed.
I want to get into some discussion of some specific policy battles that we might be seeing over the next, let's say 3 years, just for the sake of argument. But one more kind of big picture question first, and that is, if you look at the last few months since the DPJ's defeat, I mean, it has been, some of the smaller opposition parties have been strengthened most likely because they had a sort of clear agenda that attracted the minority that is against LDP policy. But in general, I mean, we're in a period where the opposition is incredibly weak. There's no one with anywhere near the numbers of support to sort of challenge the LDP in a unified kind of way right now. So are we back to the, let's say, 1955 system, as it's called, where the LDP was kind of, people could nip at it but not really overturn it? Is the forum for political debate, which for a while looked like it was shifting to elections where people would choose between different parties, or is it now going back to everything, the internal LDP debate is everything that decides Japanese politics? Or at the same time, you could look, 2009 and 2012, 2 elections in a row where the Japanese electorate kicked out one party and brought in another one. That had never happened before. Now it's happened twice in a row. Granted, we're looking at probably 3 years from now, the next time that this it comes to a head. But the other interpretation could be that we have actually entered not necessarily a period of permanent LDP resurgence, but a period where the electorate has gotten a taste of power, if you like, and is going to punish the party in power possibly every time. It's a bit of prognosticating, I think, but maybe Asao, you can start, Asao Sensei.
Well, I guess the answer is that. I mean, Michael has said that LDP has a strong base, except for New Kome Party and Communist Party. I think the strong base has become much weaker than before. Some examples that I could give you is that the candidates that ran for the last election for the upper house in July in the national electorate, they've only won, the biggest one I think won 400,000. He was the representation from the postal service, and that was the biggest number. Each and every members that won the election from the New Kome Party won close to 1 million votes, or maybe not much as million, but close to that. That means that those who support New Kome Party has a stronger face in the party compared to LDP. Now that's not to say, if you compare the 400,000 number, that is 4 times bigger as the biggest number of votes that won in my party. It's called your party, by the way. Kawada-san has won about 100,000 votes, or more than 100,000. But that's 1/4 of what LDP candidate has won. What I'm trying to say is that the supporting base of the newer parties, of course, is much weaker. But a supporting base of LDP as well is much weaker than before. For instance, let's say, it used to be that people representing the doctors used to win like 500,000 votes or close to 1 million, but now they can't win, and the reason is simple. The reason behind that is that these groups cannot give those who compose the groups as much benefit as they used to. Now it's we are developed country, and we grow at a speed at most at 2% in real terms. That means that you can't give every group members as much benefit as you used to. All you could do is reduce the amount of the benefit cuts, and so if that is big, and there are much bigger number of voters outside of these special interest groups, and these people swing by, so that's why if Abe could give the general public with the real growth of 2%, then I think he will be successful in the coming election 3 years from now. But if he can't, then that there will be a strong dissatisfaction. And so that's.
They're not available. Kono-sensei, you want to go next?
Yeah. Ishikai or agricultural association, Nokyo or post office or whatever, getting less and less votes, just like Asao-san said. But that is good for LDP actually, because we don't have to really depend on them, or they cannot be the showstopper. If we have to, we can ignore them. In old days, we really depend on their organization to get the votes. So we really have to protect their interest, and we have to get the money and vote from them in return. Now their influence is getting less and less. So LDP has free hand, and a lot of LDP member can actually vote for deregulation. So the change is actually good for LDP. And frankly speaking, for next some years, the opposition doesn't really matter, because for last 20 years, our economy has stagnated, So we lost wealth for redistribution. I mean, the opposition who wants to redistribute the wealth, I think we have to create the wealth to distribute first. So for next some years, the opposition doesn't really matter. And they are so fragmented. And I'm not sure if there can be any threat to LDP in the next general election. So the issue is, can we deal with internal opposition in LDP and make the economy forward? I think in old days, 1955 system, it was sort of a capitalist against the communist or socialist. But that time is over. The socialist has only 2 seats in the lower house, and the communist is much less than before. So we are now competing in a capitalistic economy and capitalistic democratic economy, and I think LDP need to redefine itself as a party for economic growth. And so, as Asao-san mentioned before, we have to get rid of those LDP members who are actually socialist. We don't need them in the party, and they are the one who oppose to all the deregulation. So we cannot say welcome back to everybody. We just have to tell them to leave. And can we do that? I think that'll be the question for LDP for next 3 years. And in the next general election, can we select the right candidate? I think that is the question for LDP leadership.
So yeah, you can answer that, but I'll throw out the next question too, which is related, and we'll start with you. You can answer them all together, just so we don't get boring and just 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But does that, you kind of touched on this topic that's been around for years now about a kind of grand realignment of Japanese politics, which it would always be understood to come about at a time when the LDP kicked out its, as you said, sort of socialistic or kind of big government members, or they left in a rage, and then politics was reformed around 2 big parties where you had the kind of free market party and then the old school rump, which they would compete for the name LDP, the other would get a different name, and then there would be a real kind of ideological clarity to Japanese politics for the first time in forever. That was something that people thought was happening maybe with the rise of the DPJ. Now it looks more in doubt. So I mean, is that kind of grand ideological realignment now dead because of the LDP's return to such strength, or do you think something like what Kono Sensei is saying, where even in a period of LDP strength, there will be some kind of purge or split that could still realign politics in Japan?
I don't know where you get the idea that the LDP is not a socialist party. If I may, I seem to have noticed that a Mr. Paul Krugman, a Mr. Joseph Stiglitz have laid their hands on Abenomics and said, this is good, this is the way it should be. Japan is blessed with a conservative government that has the world's most liberal economics, which is something we have nowhere else in the world. When conservative parties come in, we have restrictive policies regarding budgeting, regarding monetary policy. Here in Japan, we have the exact opposite. So having the LDP in power has nothing to do with rationalization of the economy or possibly even a growth strategy. I'm not sure. We have to see what happens in the fall. In terms of your original question, are we going back to the 1955 system? Even under the 1955 system, there was at least half an opposition. So we had a 1.5 system of parties, with the LDP and the socialists meeting on the side and arrange, okay, we're going to have a little bit of a show in the diet, but at the end of the day, this is the legislation that's going to pass. We then had a 2.0 system with 2 conflicting parties, and it turned out to end up in gridlock when one party would control one house and one party would control the other. Now we are in a 1.0 system. There is the LDP and its ally, the new Komeito, and I'm sorry, very little else. They have a 2/3 majority in the House of Representatives. Bingo, anything they want to pass. Let's make Swedish the national language. Done by the afternoon. If you want to do something now, if there's anything that Abe-san wants to do, as long as he controls the party, there is nothing that Asao Sensei can do except wave his hand. And maybe they won't even allow that anymore. That's the reality that we live in political terms.
So Asao Sensei, I'll put it to you. We have two different visions of the LDP in 2013 here. One is with a rising force of kind of pro-free market, young, liberal-minded people that may succeed in pushing the retrenched interests out. Here we have the LDP is, or the LDP is a kind of socialist party, always has been, and maybe always will be. What do you think? Is the only hope for people like Kono Sensei to join your team?
Well, you would welcome Kono-san any time at your party. I think the historically LDP was more of a socialist party than a market-friendly party, and that there was I think there's a reason for that, because you know, after World War II, you had to recover. You would have to put the resources to an area where you believed that would grow, and that we were successful. However, having succeeded in growing, I think we would have to let the market decide, because market is much more smarter than any individual. And could that be done? That's the question, because some of the even the big business is more willing to step slightly on the socialist side, or much on the socialist side. One example that I could give you is I don't know whether LDP could really deregulate the electricity. You know, whether you can choose electricity company that you would like to buy electricity from. Probably Mr. Taro Kono is the most proactive player was in LDP, but there are other members who aren't that willing to do that in that sense. I personally is proposing to look at the balance sheet of TEPCO, because if you look at the balance sheet of TEPCO, two power plants within Fukushima Daiichi power plant is still is their good asset, and the 4 power plants of Fukushima number 2 is still their good asset. And I look at Mr. Terry Porte and remembering about LTCB and Nisaigen. You know, if you look at the balance sheets of these companies, and if you really revise these assets, then the TEPCO probably would go down underwater, and that would start dividing the power grid with the power plants, which would start deregulate the electricity in Japan, because TEPCO's area would cover 40% of the electricity sold in Japan. And could that be done under Abe cabinet? I think Abe-san would favor that, but I don't know whether, just as Taro-san, Kono-san said, my gut feeling is that 51% of the LDP members would probably oppose that.
Yeah, why don't we just get very quickly, Kono-sensei, what percentage of LDP parliamentarians do you think, maybe not that specific issue, but favor a kind of a general worldview that you share, then that you say is now growing within the party?
Well, I would say 50% of freshmen would agree to that. I don't know about the senior politician, but they are coming out of the closet now. You know, they've been pretending to be the socialist, but I think the March 11th did a lot to change their mind, and they are now actually seeing reality and changing the position. So
Do we need to wait now 7 or so electoral terms before a majority of the cabinet shares your worldview, given the average number of terms it takes to be elevated?
Well, that system could also change. So, I mean, now we are living in a single-member district system, and a lot of LDP politicians seen two government got kicked out by the people, and they know the wind's going to be against the LDP in the next general election. I don't know if it's going to be the typhoon or it's just going to be the soft breeze, but the wind's going to be against it, and a lot of LDP members realize that. So I think it will have a lot of impact on them.
Thanks. Now, let's talk about some of the specific policy battles we're likely to see in sort of the next, well, whether it's the next 6 to 12 months or even the next, this supposedly sort of 3-year window that Abe has. Obviously, the third arrow of Abenomics, there's still a lot of blanks and a lot of weaknesses, and when the outline of it was presented in May, it did not go over particularly well. Retrospectively, that was presented as just a little bit of a taste, and then after the upper house election, we'll give you the real thing. Could you talk about some of the big battles within the specific sort of reform agenda that you expect, and as well anything beyond that, some unexpected things? We were talking a little bit in the pre-meeting about some legislation, Michael, that's coming up that you think might be controversial and might take some people by surprise. Why don't we start with you, because I know you had some specific views on the battles to come.
Yes, I see some severe battles, of course, coming up in the fall. One that's heating up is going to be the state secrets law, which is going to criminalize a lot of activities that journalists previously thought were uncovering government malfeasance and government misbehavior will now be protected and will now be prosecutable. That's going to be a battle, and the newspapers are going to be on not with the party on that one. I can see battles over TPP that are going to be fierce. I can see battles over reforms of the education system. A lot of interests are involved there, and there is a lot of history behind that. In terms of future battles, there are going to be things that are just going to pop up out of nowhere. One of them that you'll see at the bottom of articles about the Olympics is building ring roads around Tokyo. I can tell you there are folks whose houses stand in the way who are going to make the LDP's life miserable over that. And we'll have lots of lawsuits, and we'll have all kinds of bad scenes if people try to push that. That's way out in the future, but that's something that a government that has been on a roll and has seen nothing but blue skies will make mistakes over, I think.
All right, Asao Sensei, you have a very, your party has a very specific set of recommendations for what would qualify as the kind of third arrow agenda items. Which ones are you confident might go your way, so to speak, and which ones do you think are going to be tough battles, and what are you going to be highlighting in diet questioning, that kind of thing?
Okay. Well, I think the one policy that probably or is likely to be adopted and also would not hurt in the long term of our tax revenue is to free the depreciation schedule tax-wise. In other words, accounting-wise, it has to be fixed, but tax-wise, the investors can choose. In other words, building like this, you have to, tax-wise, you have to depreciate in 30 years. But if the investor could choose whether you are going to depreciate in 1 year, then from the 29 years remaining, you would have to pay without depreciating asset. But that would boost the investment. And I think that 100% will not happen, but something like that would happen.
Tell us why that hasn't happened so far.
Because Ministry of Finance is against it. And the reason they are against it is because they are looking at 1-year schedule. And they may lose tax revenue for a year, but the second year, if the investor doesn't have any depreciating asset, then he would have to pay for the tax. And of course, the investor would like to recover whatever is invested, not just the tax bracket amount. So that is probably rational, and I think that could happen. And what is not, something is likely to happen, but not in the full scale, is deregulation. I think the biggest difficulty lies in the utility, electricity. Agriculture, in the long run, I think something would happen. Healthcare, yes, but not in the full scale.
And thank you. And Konosuke, what about you? Particularly, if you could touch also on the utilities and not just the general industry deregulation, but about recent moves to kind of nationalize the effort at cleanup effort up in Fukushima. I think we'll talk about that in a little more detail later. But I know that's, you've been very involved in that. And then give us anything if you have on top of that in terms of reform that you have hopes for or that you think might be dead in the water.
Well, I don't think TEPCO could handle the Fukushima situation anymore. And the government has announced they would pay for some of the cleanups. The thing is it going to be loaned to TEPCO, or the government simply going to pay from the taxpayers? If that's the case, the taxpayers' money is going to be spent to protect TEPCO shareholders and the loans from the banks, and that's pretty bad. So we really need to call TEPCO bankrupt and let the government take over and take care of the Fukushima situation. The government's not able to do that because there's a trillion-yen loans coming from major banks to TEPCO right after the March 11 without any collateral. And everyone thinks that there was a sort of secret guarantee by the ministry that TEPCO will not be called bankrupt, but the government's officially denying it. So we're going to be asking the banks, is it the case or not? And we really have to take care of the TEPCO issue, and we got to clean the mess in Fukushima. So it's going to be a big debate. And another issue is state secret bill. I think it's becoming big issue. I mean, it is necessary, but that can be used by the government bureaucracy to hide a lot of things. Like recently, like at the end of June, the third secretary of our Congo embassy set fire on our embassy in Congo, Kinshasa. The embassy burned down, and the foreign ministry is covering up. And the foreign minister even doesn't know about anything. So there's a lot of things that the bureaucrats trying to cover, and this new bill can be used for that. We need a lot of whistleblower to prevent those happening. But unlike United States, we don't have Mr. Snowden, and I don't know if this bill gonna be a good thing or not. I mean, it is a necessary thing, but how are we going to let bureaucrats not use that bill to cover up? That's going to be the issue. And the end of the year, the TPP, those agricultural 5 product, I don't think we can all put in the case. So there has to be some kind of compromise between the government and farmers. It's going to be a difficult issue to handle, but I think we have to be in TPP for sure. So what kind of negotiation can we do with farmers? And we cannot, one thing we cannot do is like after the Uruguay round, spend the money on whatever for compensation for the farmers. I don't think we can afford to do that.
A 6 trillion yen payoff to farmers.
Right. And it went to some kind of road construction or whatever. It didn't really come to the farmers. It didn't help the agricultural industry at all at the end of the day, and I don't think we can do that. And then we have to tackle the government expenditure. I mean, it's going crazy. It's like 99 trillion yen for the next year's expenditure. I don't think we can afford even with a 3% raise of the consumption tax. So how are we going to cut the expenditure for next year or next certain years? That's going to be a big battle, and that's where those vested interests come in. And can LDP fight against it, or LDP stay as a socialist for next decade? That's the big test for that.
Michael, I know you have something to add, but I just wanted to ask one more question, follow up. The consumption tax rise looks like it's going to be offset by maybe 5 trillion yen in stimulus spending. I think the logic behind that, such as there is one, is that the stimulus is kind of a short-term cushion. Stimulus runs out, the revenue from higher consumption tax is forever, so we can afford this now. But there's also seems to be a debate about, for example, do we lower corporate income tax as part of stimulus or connected to the stimulus? These would be more permanent offsets to their extra revenue. Mm-hmm. Is the corporate income tax debate within the LDP serious right now? Where do you see that heading?
Well, the corporate tax cut's being debated within LDP, and it's divided, I think. I don't know that division lies in the center or leaning toward which way. I'm not quite sure. But Social Security spending will rise for sort of permanently if we don't do anything. And we got to change the Social Security system from square one, but we are not doing it. The government's supposed to have had a sort of a national conference on the Social Security, but what came out of it was just a meaningless nothing. And we got to go back to the Social Security issues, especially the pension and the medical thing. And can we really do that? It's going to be the next question. That's probably for the next year, not this year.
Thank you. You had something to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add to the really, really big battles that are coming up. The one, I can't believe that I missed it, the first round, is reactor restarts. Here, I stated that the LDP could do whatever it wants. Yes, in the diet, but in terms of the reactor restarts, that's where we come up against the real barrier, which is local government. In the case of local mayors and the prefectural governors who have to sign off on the restarts. Some are pro, but most are not. And if Japan is going to work on its energy provision and energy security, that division, that Chiho Bunken issue, is going to loom and is going to cost I think the Abe government some serious political capital to overcome, because the only way to overcome it, right, is to have a national law.
Could I add to that? The nuclear reactor restart thing is a pretty difficult issue. Number one, all the scientific decision has to be made by NRA, and there's no political intervention supposedly in it. Number two, the power industry and the METI have to tell the truth. They are not telling lies right now, but that's different from telling truth. What's happening is once you restart reactors, the spent fuel pool going to be filled up. Some reactor for 3 years. Within 3 years, they have to be shut down. And probably most of them need to be shut down within 10 years. So what they have to do is they have to get the spent fuel out of the pool, put in the dry cask, and put them somewhere in a nuclear power plant. And they have to negotiate with the local government. That's something they have to do. And they are sort of avoiding that. Number two, they are telling the local people that all the spent fuel pool are going to be shipped to Rokkasho reprocessing plant, but the spent fuel there is already filled up. And if they don't start the reprocessing plant, the power industry will not be able to get the fund to pay off the loan for the reprocessing plant. So the government need to change the law so that even if the reprocessing plant's not running, the power company can get hold of the fund. And there's all the financial complications involved in whether or not to start the reactor. But the power industry is not telling the people about it. So we have to get those things in. And then as Asao-san said, all those spent fuels are now in the asset side of the balance sheet. But it's actually supposed to be liability. So they have to move those from asset to liability, and they have to pay for that. And some power company may have a huge deficit because of it. So there's a lot of financial issues involved, but none of them are talking about it. None of them are asking for help. We need to help them out. We need to bail them out to do that. And we have to have a sort of a national agreement how to deal with the spent fuel. We just cannot leave it in the pool and pretend there is none. So there are a lot of things we have to be doing, but power companies and the government are not putting that on the table. And that is not good. That would further erode the confidence or credibility of the government and the industry. And that's going to cost us a lot more in the long run.
Thanks. We're going to move to the Q&A soon, but I want to just finish up with just a little bit more on the politics of nuclear power. And it's wanted to ask, I think both of you have touched on the debate about the government needing to take a stronger lead on the cleanup effort, maybe almost implying that the debate over whether TEPCO should be declared bankrupt and fully nationalized might be reopening again. I mean, that seemed like a debate that was settled quite soon after the accident in the negative. The government, it seems to me that a lot of the problems that we're seeing now are partly a result of a kind of chuto-hampa nationalization, where the government bailed out TEPCO, bought enough shares under a convoluted scheme that it could say that it was in control kind of when it suited it, but not really, so it's up to you. And ultimately, no one's really taking responsibility. So one, do you think that there will be a full reopening of the debate about not just whether the government should spend some budget to freeze the earth around Fukushima, but really actually on TEPCO's status, whether it can be allowed to go bankrupt and actually clearly nationalized? Is that likely to reopen? And then also, how are politicians reading the general kind of political mood on nuclear power? Because if you ask Japanese voters, do you think we should have nuclear power or not? In a very simple question, a lot of polls show that a majority of people will say no. Of course, if you ask the question differently, you might get a different answer. But then in the last election, they had a chance to vote for a whole bunch of parties that said no nuclear, and then one party that said supposedly what the opposite of what they think, and they voted for that party. So I mean, what are the real, they voted in the LDP, which was, in spite of the fact that supposedly the public is anti-nuclear. Does that say something about the priorities of the country right now? What does it say about the risks for pushing restarts, for example, politically?
Well, I absolutely. I think the situation, not just in Fukushima, the nuclear power plant, the whole of the nuclear power plant issue should be handled by the government, because the risk is, if something happens, it cannot be paid back by a private entity. For instance, Fukushima power plant belonged to TEPCO, the largest power plant in Japan. But should it belong to Hokuriku Power Company, then they could not handle it by their balance sheet. So the situation was totally different, I'm sure. And even TEPCO, they cannot handle it. And I'm saying that government should use their preferred stock rights and look at the balance sheet. And if you look at the balance sheet, as I said, the Fukushima power plant has two power plants that is still on the balance sheet, and Fukushima number 2 has 4 that's on the balance sheet. If you just write them off, then they will be underwater. And I'm not saying that for the sake of just having TEPCO bankrupt, but I think that would, it's like the national railways. They were under criticism for a long time. But once it was divided into JR East, West, and Tokai, no one would blame on the people working at JR now. And unless you do something drastic, people would leave TEPCO. A lot of them are leaving, and then you know, you're losing the talents. And so I think and also one example that I could give you is that restarting the reactor in Niigata would be much difficult compared to other reactors because it's owned by TEPCO. But that's irrational. You know, if you are going to restart a reactor, it should be decided solely on scientific reasons. But because of the fact that it's owned by TEPCO, people would say, no, we shouldn't restart the reactor in Niigata. And to overcome all these issues is to restart TEPCO by dividing it into several companies after declaring its bankrupt. And it could be controlled, the processes.
Thanks. Unless you have something urgent to add, I think I'd like to just move into Q&A. There may be questions on this issue as well. We've got a little bit between 15 and 20 minutes, I suppose. So if you could keep your questions question-like and address, tell us who you are and who you'd like to answer your question to. I see Tim had his hand up.
Hi, Tim Kelly from Reuters. You talked about, Michael, you talked about the lack of opposition in Japan, that, you know, we're into kind of the back to the one-party system in Japan with the LDP in power. But even though the opposition now is very fragmented and there are kind of lots of parties and there's no real threat to the LDP, what, you know, kind of looking into your crystal ball, you know, as time goes forward, what do you see as the issues or policies that a new opposition could coalesce around in Japan that could eventually challenge the LDP to power? Would you see this as being a renewed DPJ, or would the DPJ become kind of part of another opposition party? I'd just like to hear all the panel members' views on that.
I'll go first. The DPJ lived a charmed life. They did not know, as they were developing and becoming an opposition party, that the people did not love them. They loved the idea of an opposition party. And so when the DPJ took over and had to run a government, it had a great deal of enthusiasm, but it was about beating the LDP. We had beaten the LDP, we'd turned things over, and what do you guys have to do? And the thing is, how they won, and the LDP cried foul, you're cheating, was by creating a mini LDP under Ozawa. Ozawa simply replicated the big tent party of the LDP, making promises to the truckers, making promises to the farmers that the LDP said, you can't afford this. This bill is way too big. If you add up all the numbers, there's no way it works. And Ozawa would say, no, we can make it work. Well, when they got into power, they couldn't make it work. Now, what was the attraction of the DPJ? It wasn't really the money. It was the idea of having an LDP that was clean and honest. But when the DPJ took over, and it turned out not to have the effectiveness of the LDP, it may have had cleanliness and honesty, but that's not really not worth very much. You're asking me what could be a future concept around which a new opposition can coalesce? Well, Asao Sensei can talk about the difficulties his party has had with people who think they know what that answer is. But basically, we see some members of the opposition parties thinking about a three-way with the Isshin no Kai, with Asao Sensei's party, with fragments from the DPJ. But what's their program? There isn't one. And again, it goes back to this issue of the LDP as a conservative party with a liberal economic program, an expansionist, very, very bold economic program. What could possibly an opposition offer to compete with that?
I don't know. Asano-san, you want to respond to that?
Well, I think the two policy arena that could unite the opposition in a soft manner. One is promoting deregulation. If LDP fails to promote deregulation as if that happens, that could form a sort of coalition among the oppositions, except for those members within DPJ that favor bigger government. Secondly, as far as the diplomacy and national security is concerned, if Abe, Prime Minister Abe, is going to be inclined to revise the history, which would cause big tension between China and Korea and Japan. And not just that, the Chinese government probably would engage in massive propaganda in the United States, which might undermine the U.S.-Japan alliance. And that would cause the oppositions with realistic approach towards diplomacy, and not diplomacy, but national security. And that also would probably would not include those members within DPJ who are on the left wing, and also would not include those members within Ishin-no-Kai alt-right people. And then that would probably win support from the middle class Japanese, not on the real alt-right wing parties supporting members. And then again, as I said, the Japanese parties, including LDP, do not have as much strong base. You know, we don't have as many Japanese as many Americans who say they're Republican or who say they're Democrats. A lot of them are so-called mutoha. They change parties. So if what I said, the two things, deregulation and realistic national security, it could have a coalition, then the opposition may have a chance, depending upon whether Abe is inclined to change the other move.
Kono-san, did you have something to add to that? You picked up your mic.
I don't think labor union-based DPJ can accommodate deregulation. I think they are for more regulation to protect their interest. I think if the political realignment happens in Japan, probably best way is to have your party getting loose coalition with LDP and make it your LDP. Yeah, because your party is clearly for economic growth, and if LDP is changing itself to the party for economic growth, that's going to be the natural coalition, and Watanabe-san and your party could join LDP as a Watanabe faction of LDP, and that's probably the most realistic realignment, and we get the rest as sort of a bunch of opposition.
All right, interesting. That's a very confusing electoral map.
Can I?
Yeah,
Thank
sorry,
you.
who's choosing here? But yes, go ahead.
Hi. My name is
One,
Taejong
two,
Shin. I'm an
three.
investment professional, but I founded my NPO called Living in Peace to support children in orphanages in Japan. And I found that those children or the poor people are more, hardly affected by sluggishness in policy making. Currently, the government expenditure for children and family is less than 10% of that for elderly people. And so my question is first is that do you think that the current political system of Japan is optimal to cope with this rapidly changing society? And second thing is that do you think you'll be really able to bring about the real regulation that is much needed for, I think, for our people? Thank you.
Well, maybe Kono-sensei, you can answer that since you're in the party of government.
In the last general election in my district, those who actually voted, 8% of them were in 20s, 13% were in 30s. So 20s and 30s combined, it's less than a quarter. And so I think the voters are more getting old and old. And if politicians wanted to be elected, I think they would have to focus on the senior voters in the future. And that is against what you say, younger generation in Japan are sort of left out. But if you look at the current situation, we need to change our demography. And in order to do that, we have to change system so that young couple could raise more and more children. One issue is every cabinet has a minister for Shoshika Tanto, but that tend to be the female who has become cabinet minister for the first time. And she will probably be the least powerful cabinet member. And we cannot do that. I think if we have like Aso Taro, Fukusori, and Minister for Shoshika Tanto, then we can change the things around.
So I think single-handedly.
What? So I think we really need to change our mentality and try to focus more on the younger generation. And I think that's kind of difficult in the current demography, but that's something I think the politicians have to do.
Thanks very much. I want to make sure we get in a couple of more questions. I saw you've got the mic now. Yeah, these mics are being handed out.
Yeah, Greg Story. I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on good government in Japan. Prior to Koizumi government, basically most of the ministers rotated on an annual basis. You spent about 1 year as minister. So basically they know nothing about their portfolio because they're too busy politicking and they're too busy being moved on. Koizumi basically declared war on the LDP and the factions, and he kept ministers in place relatively longer. And now we've gone through not only a minister a year, we've gone through a prime minister a year in the LDP until the DJP got back in. LDP's back in now. Are we likely to see a situation where Japan going forward will have ministers who actually know something about their portfolios? And I give you by reference, I'm an Australian, we've just had an Australian election. The ministers who are coming into this new government will be declared shortly. Some of those guys have been in those, what we call shadow minister portfolios for 6 years. They have been vigorous opposition against the ministers, knowing the portfolio, knowing the detail in depth. They can stand up without notes, they can talk about it because they know it. And any government in a situation in Australia, the ministers like that. When I was previously working for the Australian Embassy, I had a lot to do with politicians visiting from Australia, and I was always struck by the contrast that those ministers could get up without notes, talk about their portfolio in depth. You could never get any Japanese minister, unless the very, very elite group who were kept in their portfolios for a long time, able to do that because they just simply weren't there long enough. So are we going to see a government system in Japan where ministers will stay longer in their portfolios and actually know something about them?
How about it? Yeah, go ahead.
In order for us to do that, we have to change the sort of party-government relationship. Right now, any government bill that comes to the parliament, it has to go to the party, and the party needs to authorize first. So our cabinet minister is not as powerful as your cabinet ministers in Australia. It has to take orders from the party for some time. And like in UK, a lot of conservative members voted against the Syrian thing, and the government resolution has been voted down. That never happens in Japan, because whatever the government table, LDP member have to vote for it. I voted against it. I was censured for a year when we were opposition. So if we can change the government and party relationship, give real power to the government, and the party allowed to vote against the government bill in the parliament, then we could have that kind of minister and the shadow ministers. So I don't know which comes first, but if the current system goes on, I think we still have a sort of a rotational minister. I mean, Abe-san is trying to keep the minister as they are, but senior vice ministers and the parliamentary secretary are changing as of end of September or something. So it's a similar thing. So I don't think it's coming soon, but we hope to change the system in that way for sure. But it is pretty difficult with the faction, because faction leaders have to give all the members satisfied. And in order to do that, they tend to kick out somebody and give the job to somebody else to keep their own power. So,
Thanks. We'll take another question from Nick.
Sure. The polls suggest that that voters care about one thing and one thing only at the moment, about the economy. So it's fine talking about secret acts and so on, but that's what they care about. You mentioned TPP. That's fine. The other thing that's probably a watershed, a very important thing, particularly for foreigners and their interest in this market, is the labour mobility laws. Now, obviously, between when you first talked about third arrow and when you second, there was a big change, and the word "chien" seemed to appear apparently 3 times as many times per page. But when are you going to man up and deal with the problem of labour mobility? No one dares hire anyone in this country because they know it's a 40-year contract. You've got huge numbers of young unemployed in the country. The only way of dealing with these problems, the huge differences between industries that are long of employees and those that are short of employees, and people need to be freed up to move.
Yeah, this seems to be almost the third rail of the third arrow, if you'll allow me to mix metaphors. But yeah, has a fundamental sort of labor system, labor law reform been shelved along with the Constitution, or are we likely to see something? I'll ask you as well. Actually, first, why don't we ask?
Well, I think
first, yeah.
2 things have to happen. One is to allow companies to lay off people based on monetary compensation, and there's difference between big companies and smaller companies. Smaller companies can lay off people at any time without punishment. But if you're a big company like Japan Airlines, even if you're bankrupt, you cannot lay off people. They sue. So we would have to write a law that any company can lay off people with monetary compensation. That's one. Secondly, we would have to change the labor law so that it would suit to the service industry. Our labor law is suited for manufacturing, although the service industry has 80% of the jobs.
That's good. Now maybe Kono-sensei, that you've heard what should happen from the inside. What's likely to happen?
well, everyone sort of agree what should happen, but the issue is it's not happening. And that's the major issues. And the third arrow should cover the labor thing as well, but I don't know.
But
I don't know if-
surely it can't ignore it altogether. I mean, we've heard some proposals floated to maybe create a third category of employment where they wouldn't be fully protected, and yet that category would only be applied to growth industries, which presumably don't need to fire anybody anyway. I mean, it's all a bit messy right now, isn't it?
Well, I don't think we can start the debate from the compromise. I think we need to start the debate from the principle, and then we should compromise through the parliamentary debate. But the parliamentary debate, debate in the parliament is also, I mean, the result, and that's where you start. So it gets complicated, and I think it's, I don't know. I don't think it's happening soon.
All right. Well, I hate to end on a pessimistic note, but the clock means that we should end. We don't have any room to go overtime, I'm afraid. She looks very kibishi. All right. I want to thank everyone for coming, as well as our panelists, and maybe that's your.
Thank you very much, all. Thank you very much.